Okay, good afternoon, everyone. If you could take your seats, please. We're about to begin our session here this afternoon. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. If we could have a little bit of quiet, please. We're about to begin. Okay, you're all welcome back to our final plenary session for today. My name is Suzanne Mulligan. I'm going to be chairing this afternoon's session. I'll begin in a moment by introducing our four speakers to you, but just to let you know, there's a slight change in the protocol, so to speak, the layout of this session. Our first speaker will have a 30-minute slot. Then the remaining three speakers have a 15-minute slot each. We're hoping then to have approximately 12 to 15 minutes for Q&A and open forum. So we have a very tight schedule this afternoon. And we really need to try to stick to that as much as possible. So our first speaker this afternoon is Joshua McElwee. He is the Vatican reporter for the National Catholic Reporter. He's travelled around the world as part of the press pool with Pope Francis and has recently co-edited a collection of essays exploring the words most important to Pope Francis. That's entitled A Pope Francis Lexicon. Next, we have Teresa Forcades. She is a physician, a theologian, and a Benedictine nun in the mountain monastery of San Benet de Montserrat. She is professor in Mexico and directs a Spanish journal on critical thinking and Christianity and hosts a weekly radio program. Third up is Eric Hinilo. He is a religious priest in the Society of Jesus. He finished his doctoral studies at the former Weston Jesuit School of Theology, and he is currently associate professor at Loyola School of Theology. And finally, we have Alexander Martins. He's a Brazilian theologian and bioethicist. He's assistant professor at Marquette University. His current research focus is in Catholic social ethics and healthcare ethics, with special concentration in public and global health from a liberation theology approach. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Joshua to come up.
So hello, I've been asked to lead a workshop to walk you through some of the basics in working with the media. And as an outside observer, I've been marveling these days over your theological wizardry. But if you'll allow me to extend a Harry Potter analogy, now it's time for me to try and help you learn how to speak with non-magical muggles. For some of you with experience working with the media, some of this will be basic, but I wanted to give a good baseline because I know many people are coming from different cultures, different experiences. And I get to use a PowerPoint. So what I'm planning to do is give you an idea of some of the church teaching on media, then to talk about how journalists think, then to give you 3 steps for how you can work with reporters. Are we okay? Yeah. And then we'll do a breakout workshop where you'll actually have to talk to one another. So starting with church teaching on working with the media, or the church teaching of the media, I like to start with the Second Vatican Council document, Inter Mirifica. It was promulgated in 1963, one of the first council documents. It went through 70 drafts and wound up very short, but it has 2 major points that I think are worth mentioning. The first is it talks about the fact that if news is communicated, it can contribute to the common good. And the second is that it claims that there's a right in human society to information on subjects that are of concern to people. So I find this interesting that the Second Vatican Council had 2 major points about the role of media. And then if you fast forward 51 years, 4 years ago, Pope Francis wrote his first World Communications Day message in 2014. And he also emphasized two things, a little bit different. The first was the role of media in serving to bring people together, kind of like this conference, building bridges, and how Christians or Catholics should interact with media and journalists to meet that goal. He said that media can, quote, help us feel closer to one another and know one another better, and that communication should be used at the service of an authentic culture of encounter. So a primary example of this is how the Pope himself speaks to the media. I'm frequently part of the press pool that travels with the Pontiff as he goes to different countries. And it's striking how he speaks to us sometimes. He normally answers any question that is asked. He does not ask for the questions in advance or to know what we're going to ask of him. He also frequently says he's at our disposition. So if we have further questions, he's available. I've never quite sussed out how we're supposed to get to him to get the further questions to him, but I do appreciate the availability. So the second part here is to help you understand how a journalist thinks, in the hopes that that helps you kind of talk to them better. So a few key questions that I as a journalist and other journalists might ask themselves when evaluating, speaking with you or evaluating a story. What's new here? What makes this interesting? And what makes it human? To kind of think about how other people would be interested in the story. And then this is a bit difficult to see, but what I'm trying to say here is that there are also different kinds of stories that we journalists write. And it's helpful to think about the kind of story that when you're interacting with a journalist, they might be trying to write. Two basic styles of story are a news story, and that's at the top example, which I'll read aloud in a second. Something happened, what happened, who did it, what does it mean? Kind of very basic A, B, C, and D. A second style of story would be a more human interest story. So something that doesn't exactly have an immediate news value, but might get a deeper layer of the story or provide something interesting for readers. So in the first example, I pulled from reporting from the Associated Press about a visit of former Vice President Joe Biden to Palestine. Very quick. Vice President Joe Biden on Wednesday criticized Palestinians for a failure to, it's very, you can kind of see it's right to the news. What's the news event? And the second, in some blatant self-promotion, I chose a story I wrote about the CTEWC and the 7 women in Africa who the network is promoting to help get doctorates. And the way that I wrote that story was very different than how I would write a news story. So it's helpful to think about, when you're speaking with a journalist, what that might mean. Another example of how journalists think. We always ask ourselves, do I have all the facts? Do I have it completely accurate? And then who can I turn to give me comment or to give me a sense of why this story is important or to help explain it to my reader? And that's kind of where you fit in eventually, so that's why I'm going there. And it's also helpful to think about how you should think of us journalists. And I think you can think of us as collaborators who want to inform people and tell interesting and newsworthy stories. But you also have to keep in mind that we are often people under a great deal of stress. There are fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer of us, and we are asked to do many, many things. For example, this morning I wanted to report on this conference, but there was some news out of Rome, and so forget about that, I had to report about the news from Rome. And a side note, I'm going to provide some examples here, but this is from my context, which is a U.S. context. It may be different in your context, and it's always, just think that, you know, I might not be providing the specific answer to your situation, but I'm trying to give an overall sense. So 3 steps to working with reporters. The first, I think, is to build relationships, just like any sort of networking situation or trying to get to know people or get to know someone. And ways to go about that are pretty basic. You can reach out to us, tell us what's going on in your field, maintain relationships with journalists in your area, and treat us very kindly. So, bribing is not encouraged. So some basic questions you might ask yourself here are, you know, can you identify 2 or 3 reporters in your country or in your area of expertise who you might want to get to know? You could invite them to coffee or offer just to have a phone call with them. But when you have that phone call, the second step is very important, to define your conversation. So anytime you're speaking with a journalist, you want to be clear about how you're speaking to them. And let's see here. So at the beginning of a conversation, you always want to specify kind of what how you're imagining this conversation to go, and what you're basically telling the journalist how to use this material you're talking to them about. And the most important thing is that before you kind of give away any information to a journalist, you have to tell them how you're talking to them. If you give away the information and then tell us something like, oh, don't use that, a nice journalist will be nice about it, but others won't. You can decide which I am. So the three basic terms, and you've probably heard these, and again, they'll be different based in your own context, but on the record. Basically, that means anything you say will be used against you. So it can be used in a quote in a story, or it can be used in any way. So when you're speaking with a journalist and there's something you want to be very clear about, I want you to say this in my name, that's on the record. You can quote me on this. When you say you're speaking off the record in most contexts, that means what you're saying to the journalist cannot be used. It can't be used in any way. It's only meant to help the journalist understand what is happening or to give them a good baseline for whatever they're writing about in a way that they write about it more smartly, but that they don't use your name or identify you in any way. Again, say that before you speak to the journalist. And then the third, more sticky area is when you say you want to speak to a journalist on background. And that normally means that you want the journalist to be able to use what you're saying, but they can't use your name. So you'll see this a lot, especially in American reporting, sources close to a material or sources in the know or someone with knowledge. So what you're telling to the journalist is they can quote you, but not using your name. And typically what you want to do there is explain to them how to quote you. So you tell them, you can quote me as a person with knowledge, or you can quote me as, and you want to come to an agreement with them about how you're speaking and how you're going to be cited. So I've got some examples here, but I think they're going to be hard to read. So on the record is pretty straightforward. You say something and it appears in print. So in this example, I picked something from what the Vatican spokesperson had said about a recent news story. He gave a quote, the quote appeared in print, that's on the record. On background is different, and in this situation, let's do this one. This is an example from June about the Trump administration, which we've heard a lot about this week, where people spoke to the New York Times to reveal something, but didn't use their names. And you'll see it at the end of the paragraph. It says, according to 4 people familiar with the meetings. So these 4 people spoke to the New York Times, said, we want you to use this material, don't use my name, instead say, I'm familiar with the issue. So it's kind of straightforward. You just tell the journalist, you can define your terms. I'm speaking to you, this is all on the record. Or can this be on background? You can use me as a knowledgeable source or someone who's familiar with it. Or this is all off the record. If you quote me, I will never talk to you again. And it's important to remember that phone calls and emails also count. So if you're having an email with a journalist and you tell them something and you didn't specify that you didn't want it to be used or whatnot, that gets really sticky. So anytime you're speaking to a journalist in any way, including Facebook or Twitter, just be careful about what you're saying and define your own relationship or your terms. So the third step after reaching out and after defining your terms is just having a conversation. And it's good to think about what journalists are looking to know. So it's information that is not too far in the weeds, so things we can understand and not highly technical terms. Or news or insights that are important but others haven't written about or spoken about or you think have been underreported. So these are just a few examples of what we're looking for from an expert, which is something you are when you're giving an interview to a journalist. Why is an event that I'm covering important? What does it matter? What's the context? How does it fit in history? What tensions does it bring up that maybe haven't been covered? What are some underlying issues that we don't know about or that haven't been reported on? And more self-promotion. Just an expert example is when I went, the Pope went to Geneva in June to visit the World Council of Churches. So I asked Bishop James Massa, Auxiliary Bishop of Brooklyn, who had served for the U.S. Bishop's Office of Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs, what it meant. And so that was just an expert interview of, what does this mean? How do I explain it to the reader? And so I say you can speak journalese. So as much as you can, just use everyday words and ideas. Just kind of explain it at a base level in terms of what do you think it means, and you think about it as someone outside your field. How would they think about it? How would they consider what's going on, or why would it be important to them? And even simple lingo that you think everyone knows, if you're speaking to a non-Catholic journalist, they might not know. So for example, the Second Vatican Council, what was it? It was a meeting of bishops in the 1960s that led to a lot of reforms in the church, or something like that. Make it very base level for people. An encyclical, which is a major papal teaching document. Or the Roman Curia, which is the Vatican bureaucracy that governs the church. So again, you just consider what's new here. What information can you provide that hasn't been reported before? And what about what you're saying would surprise someone? What would make it interesting? And extra considerations always are you speaking to a Catholic outlet or not? If you're speaking to a Catholic outlet, you might be able to use words and terms you wouldn't use with a secular outlet or a widely reported news service. And when you're not comfortable with a question, you can normally, if you have a good relationship with a journalist, just say, I'm not the person to talk to on that. And you might recommend someone else or give an idea of who they could turn to, who could be an expert in that area. Okay, now it's time for the fun part, which is a scenario. So we have 4 helpers who are coming around with pieces of paper. They're in English on one side and Spanish on the back. And we have 15 minutes. And what I'm going to ask of you is, in a group of 2 or 3 people around you, one of you is going to play journalist, and one of you is going to play expert. Well, you're all experts, but you get to play expert today. Okay, so let me explain, if we can keep quiet just for a second. Shh. Hold on. Okay, so the idea is that once you get these pieces of paper, if you can just give me a second. Hold on. The idea is once you have the piece of paper, turn to the person next to you, choose who is going to be the journalist and who is going to be the expert. And then we'll do that for 7 minutes, and then we'll switch. So let me read the scenario aloud, okay? So the scenario is that the Vatican has announced that Pope Francis will follow up on his 2015 environmental encyclical Laudato Si with a new apostolic letter. It will encourage Catholics to make ethical, environmentally friendly decisions in how they buy goods and invest in companies. In a surprise move, the Pope also announces he will attend the UN Climate Change Conference in Poland in December. It is rumored that he may even call on Catholics to consider divesting from any holdings in oil companies. So one of you is the expert. A local news reporter wants to know the significance of this decision. They don't have any background in Catholic teaching, but they start the conversation by asking what it would mean for the Pope to advise Catholics on how they invest. So one of you is a journalist, one of you is the expert. Consider how you're talking, what are the terms of your conversation, what's most significant about this, and how can you refer to background material without making it too complicated. So we're going to have a 7-minute conversation, and then we'll switch. Good luck.
Yes. You could mention, you say, the first time I did this with CTEWC was in Berlin. Just say that. Okay. The bridge bills, Okay. And you did it with all the Europeans who are both Eastern and Western European, and it was fun. Okay. So just you could do that as an icebreaker to say, as you ask them the rest.
Okay.
I'm just suggesting that. That gives you more of a rapport.
Okay. Sorry.
No, I'm doing that to support you. To make it go smoother.
I hope it went well. I don't know.
Circuit is coming in at 9:30.
Oh, poor guy.
He must be down.
Is that okay?
That's great. Well, I just wasn't sure.
So it would be ideal if we
47 minutes left.
Okay, if I can bring us back. If I can bring us back. Switch. No, we're gonna switch.
Okay, everybody, if I can have your attention, we have to switch roles now. So those who were interviewing are now the interviewee. So if you could switch roles, please, for 7 minutes.
Okay, I'm sorry, but now it's over. It's time to wrap it up if we can. It's time to... Okay, if everyone can just come back, we're going to continue on with the panel. So I want to say thank you for having me with you. I hope that was a useful exercise. I did it for the first time last year with a CTEWC meeting in Berlin with about 25 younger theologians. It was a gathering of East meets West, and I didn't ever imagine I would do it with 500 theologians. So I hope it was useful, and I think we're going to move on with our next panel. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Joshua. Next we have Teresa, please.
I was asked to speak about my own experience engaging public discourse in my particular context, and also to say a word about how theological ethicists can expand beyond academic and ecclesial settings. I start by saying that I am not a theological ethicist, academically speaking. I am a Benedictine nun, and my specialty is fundamental theology, with a doctorate on the mystery of the Trinity. But I am also a physician with a doctorate in public health, and I deal publicly in a customary manner with topics directly relevant to theological ethics, for instance, abortion, sexual diversity, or social justice. My presentation will have 3 parts. I will start with a biographical summary of my main public interventions and impact. I will continue recounting the most serious experiences of conflict arising from my public activity. And then I will finish sharing 3 key elements that I consider essential for public engagement as a Christian ethicist. So first, the biographical summary. On the field of medicine. In 2006, by request of the Jesuit Institute, Christianism and Justice in Barcelona, I wrote a 40-page booklet entitled Crimes and Abuses of the Pharmaceutical Companies that had a very wide distribution in Catalan, my language, Spanish, and English. In 2009, I published a 1-hour-long internet video criticizing the WHO management of the swine flu crisis and exposing the lack of scientific evidence for the swine flu vaccine. The video had more than 1 million hits in 2 months and was translated into many languages. Besides writing in academic medical journals, I gave and still give numerous interviews on these topics and also on the negative risk-benefit balance of the papillomavirus vaccine, on alternative and integrative medicine, and also on social determinants of health and universal access to healthcare. Now the field of feminism and sexual diversity. In 2007, I published a book entitled Feminist Theology in History. Through interviews, articles, and conferences, I subsequently became known, first in my country and then also internationally, as a feminist theologian in favor of the decriminalization of abortion, of the ordination of women, and the marriage, civil but also sacramental, of homosexual couples. And last part, politics. In 2012, I was invited to give the opening lecture at the 23rd encounter of Catalan businessmen and women at the Pyrenees. And inspired on my research on the abuses of pharmaceutical companies, I chose as a topic capitalism and ethics. My lecture came as a shock. A digital newspaper registered afterwards an hour-long interview with me on that topic, and I was invited to develop it also on the Catalan public TV. After that came numerous invitations to write articles and to give interviews and conferences about my ethical critique of capitalism all over the country, and 1 year later, in the context of the Spanish economic crisis and the rising demand for Catalan political independence from Spain, I helped founding a political movement called Procés Constituent, Constituent Process, with the goal of using the opportunity of the independence to confront the social injustice of capitalism and the shortcomings of its representative democracy. In 3 months, the movement reached 47,000 adherents and became organized in more than 90 local chapters. I was then presented in a BBC article and short video as Europe's most radical nun, and have since experienced uninterrupted requests from national and international media. The peak of media pressure was reached in 2015, when I was granted an exclaustration from my monastery to run for the Catalan Parliament. The political project of the coalition I was to run with did change in the process, and I ended up deciding not to participate in the election as a candidate. Now I am preparing to go back to my monastery in September 2018 and continue from there my political engagement. That's the biographical part. Now, the most serious experiences of conflict arising from my public activity. First, within the church. In 2009, my abbess received a letter of Cardinal Frank Rodet, then prefect of the Congregation for Religious, asking that I publicly withdraw my support to the decriminalization of abortion. I did not, but wrote instead a public letter in which I attempted to clarify my position. Doing so meant engendering tensions in my own community and with the bishop, and risking a disciplinary sanction. I was not sanctioned, or up to now I have not been. Maybe when I come back home. I have not this yet, but I must say that on 3 occasions since then, one occasion in Spain, in Cordoba, the other one in Lima, in Peru, and the other one in Los Angeles, in the USA, a bishop vetoed that I speak in his diocese. Now, conflict with the pharmaceutical companies. In 2010, I was informed that 2 big pharmaceutical companies removed their financial support from a medical congress because I was invited as a speaker. The scientific committee of that Congress, it was the National Spanish Congress on Preventive Medicine, decided to invite me nonetheless. But I have been effectively vetoed to speak on a medical congress at least on 1 occasion, and misguided articles about my medical research and views have appeared in the regular press and on the internet. If I were dependent on my medical career for my living, the amount of pressure that I have received so far would have been enough to have me silenced. And third one, the political activity, or because of my political activity. From 2013 until 2016, I was active frontline in Catalan politics and experienced firsthand the violence of party politics and the mixing of ideological confrontation and personal attack. During that time, public questioning came from 2 sides, the social and the religious. Many on the left, on the political spectrum, many on the left of the political spectrum did not find acceptable that a nun be leading an anti-capitalist socio-political movement. Many in the church did not find acceptable that a nun, particularly a cloistered Benedictine, be involved in politics at all. Now I come to the third part, which I can say very briefly. This is not in the paper, but 3 practical things that I have learned from all this, or I'm learning from all this dealing with the media. But then I have prepared 3 points that are a bit more in depth of what I think might not seem directly relevant to our engagement with the media, but for me, the 3 of them are very relevant. So The practical points are very simple, and Josh has already said, of course, I don't give any interview, be it live or not, if I don't have anything to say. That seems simple. But if you are called from the BBC, you might think, oh yes, I want to be on the BBC, because that will help I don't know what. No, I say no. If I don't have anything to say, it's true also what he said. If I am not sure, I can say it in a few sentences, which I always tend to speak a lot, but it's because I expand. But in my mind, I have something concrete to say that can be said briefly, and my way to check that is that I explain that to the 90 years old in my monastery, and they get it. So that's me. And the second one, that's not enough to have something to say for me to accept an interview. I need to have the idea, then I'll see the reality whether the idea is true, but I need to have the impression that I'm going to enjoy the interview. Otherwise, I don't give it because I have the experience. It gets through wrongly. If you're not enjoying it in the sense of, 5 minutes, okay. So the third one on these three is I also try to know not who the journalist is, that's not so important for me, but who the audience is going to be. Now, the three more in depth. First one is, I think, 3 key elements that I consider essential for public engagement as a Christian ethicist. First one is a joyful but questioning inner disposition. I am deeply thankful to be a member of the church, and I am also deeply thankful for the theological tradition of the church. And yet, I have questions. I do have questions, many questions. Questions that are my own, and with which I approach the public space. I mentioned that I wrote my theological dissertation on the Trinity. The Trinity, God who gives, traditionally is called the Father. God who receives, traditionally called the Son. And God who shares, traditionally called the Spirit. God the Trinity is God who does not only give, it is also God who receives and shares within itself and in relationship to us, because God can only relate to us as God is. As a sacrament of the Trinitarian God, the Church cannot conceive itself only as a giver, Ecclesia Mater et Magistra, the Church, mother and teacher. The Church, we as a Church, certainly, have a lot to give to the non-Christians, but we have equally to receive, and we have equally to share. Do I, as a Christian ethicist, believe this? Do I articulate it in my work? How? Second point is the conviction that there are only 2 absolutes. As theologians, we learn that there is only one absolute, that is God. However, liberation theologian Bishop Pere Casaldàliga wrote many years ago that there are 2 absolutes. Yes, God and hunger. Jesus himself associated our welcoming of him to our welcoming of the hungry ones. And John cried out against the hypocrisy of trying to honor God who we do not see without loving the brother who we see. Following Jesus implies coming to the public space to put theology to the service of the hungry. And the third point, the willingness to lovingly cause conflict. Conflict with one's surrounding culture, with one's government, with one's employer, with the magisterium, with your family or community, with loving Pope Francis, conflict with your best friend, conflict with your students, with your dean, within yourself. Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. In the name of Jesus, are we supposed to cause conflict? How? Whoever has a backbone, for example, the feminists, has enemies. One can and should love one's enemies, but one cannot pretend not to have them, and one should not try to avoid them. This is at least how I understand the biblical notion of parousia, boldness. Boldness parrhesia is not incompatible with humility, but is incompatible with fear and self-censure. Trusting God as a public theologian equals trusting that you can speak freely what you really believe and think in church and society. Doing so will certainly have consequences, and some might be quite harsh. But Jesus never said that trusting God was going to be easy, did he? Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Next we have Eric, please.
I will be sharing on my experiences and observations on engaging in public discourse in a divided society in the Philippine context. My engagement in public discourse is shaped and guided by my membership in a number of institutions. I'm an ordained minister of the Catholic Church in the Philippines, a vowed religious of the Society of Jesus, and an associate professor at Loyola School of Theology in Manila. The institutions I belong to provide me with unique opportunities to engage in public discourse with a variety of audiences, and they form communities of support that sustain me personally and professionally. I would like to share two challenging situations of public discourse, one in the past and another in the present. The first situation emerged in 2010 when a law was proposed in the Philippine Congress that aimed to provide easier and more affordable access to reproductive health services to citizens, especially the poor. The Bishops' Conference rejected the proposed law and refused to compromise with the government. The bishops argued that increasing government funding and support to improve public access to contraception and sterilization was morally equivalent to supporting abortion. Attempts by legislators to dialogue with church leaders were unsuccessful. The hierarchy encouraged political allies to obstruct the law's passage in Congress. Some bishops even threatened a Catholic vote against politicians who were in favor of the law. The Bishops' Conference issued several statements warning about threats against the sanctity of life if the law was passed. With encouragement of church leaders, many Catholic institutions published similar statements of opposition. The Jesuit Provincial Superior in the Philippines chose not to issue a statement. Instead, he asked 3 Jesuits, including myself, to write a set of talking points to move the national conversation away from condemnations and foster respectful dialogue between the Church and the government. The talking points were intended to help find common ground by suggesting revisions to the proposed law that addressed both the moral concerns of the Church and the development goals of the government. The talking points were released under the name of Loyola School of Theology and were shared by email to friends and partner institutions for posting in their blogs and websites. This indirect and informal manner of sharing the talking points was meant to avoid the impression that the Jesuits were openly challenging the official position of the Bishops' Conference. However, even with this precaution, the talking points provoked negative reactions from some bishops and Catholic groups. Complaints about Loyola School of Theology were raised during an annual meeting of the Bishops' Conference. We became worried that bishops would stop sending their seminarians to study in our school. Fortunately, a number of bishops who were friendly with the Jesuits assured us of their support. The 2 senior Jesuits who co-authored the talking points wrote regularly in newspaper columns, and they actively engaged their readers on issues related to reproductive health, religious freedom, and the relation between church and state. I, on the other hand, avoided talking to the news media. This was because of my experience with some local reporters who tended to reduce long interviews to simple sound bites. I also avoided social media because of the uncivil debates that were happening in that platform. I accepted invitations to present the talking points to parishes, schools, and communities. In these occasions, I tried to make sure that the open forum would be structured to avoid heated arguments. However, even with the most careful planning, there will be people in the audience who will not engage in respectful conversation, and often passionate exchanges will disrupt the proceedings. During this period, I had to deal with two different groups of people. One group was composed of clergy and laity who insisted on imposing Catholic norms on Filipino society. These people were so used to a predominantly Catholic environment that they believed that government policy should follow church teaching. I had to speak to them with clarity and firmness, using Catholic social teachings to correct their misconceptions about the role of the church in public life. The other group I had to deal with was composed of persons who had become so angry with the political interventions of some bishops that they constantly criticized the hierarchy. They were reacting to the long history of the church's dominance of civic and political life in the country. For this group, I tried to give signs of hope in the local church by pointing out a number of moderate bishops who set an example of prudent church leadership. What was most helpful for me during this very challenging period was the support of my colleagues and my religious community. I felt that I was protected by my religious superiors. My provincial had the foresight of communicating early with our Superior General in Rome to explain our efforts to foster dialogue. Our Superior General supported the decision to publish the talking points. This support assured me that what I was doing was consistent with my mission as a religious and as a moral theologian. The debate eventually ended when the proposed law was passed in 2012. Humbled by its failure to stop the passage of the law and shaken by public criticism at its hardline stance, the Bishops' Conference began to adopt a less aggressive approach in its public statements. At present, a different situation affects public discourse in the country. A majority of Filipinos support the current president, Rodrigo Duterte, even if he does not respect the protection of human rights for all persons in society. The president had launched an anti-drug campaign that has led to the deaths of thousands of persons. The bishops condemned the violence of the president's war against drugs. In response, the president repeatedly expressed contempt for the church through the use of foul language, attacks on religion, and accusations of clerical misconduct. What is very disturbing for church leaders is the fact that the president remains popular with many Filipinos. Public discussions on social issues often result in polarization between opponents and supporters of the president. Families, parishes, and even religious communities have become divided. In my school, as well as in my community, we had to learn to be careful about expressing criticism about the president in public and in social media to avoid provoking conflicts with our collaborators, employees, and the people we serve. During the first months of the president's drug war, many concerned civic and religious organizations published statements condemning the rising number of persons who are killed in police operations or by unidentified assailants. As the drug war continued, I began to question the effectiveness of issuing more statements of protest in the face of the government's hostility to dissenting voices. Although I believe that public statements are still necessary to raise awareness of unjust situations, a multitude of statements can become counterproductive. Too many statements from different groups saying the same thing can become repetitious, leading to diminishing public interest in the message being communicated. Apart from official statements coming from the Bishops' Conference, statements from various groups and institutions receive only minimal attention from the news, media, and are often quickly forgotten. The angry tone of some of these statements can also reinforce existing social divisions. In the current situation, some concerned citizens have turned away from political debates and have begun to focus on concrete actions that address the root causes of poverty, substance abuse, and the culture of violence. Rather than directly confront a powerful and popular president, many civic groups have decided to concentrate on saving lives, one person at a time. Some church leaders are also moving in the same direction. Dioceses have started to organize parish-based drug rehabilitation programs to provide treatment and sanctuary to drug users. There are efforts by parish priests and bishops to dialogue with local officials and law enforcers who are involved in the anti-drug campaign and are complicit with the violence. A bishop whose diocese is one of the killing fields of the drug war said that, as a shepherd, he considers both the victims and offenders as members of his flock. He wants to protect the targets of the drug war and convert those who seek to do them harm. In the present context in the Philippines, the Church needs to learn that acts of mercy can speak louder than angry words. Our public engagements should focus on protecting the vulnerable, overcoming divisions, and taking up the challenge of dialogue. Echoing the theme of our conference, our local church should strive to build bridges to a future where all persons are respected and protected. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Alexandra, please.
Oi, tudo bem? Ethics and public discourse. Building bridges between theology and destitute seek. Bring Catholic theological ethics to the public discourse is a challenge that must be faced with humility and prophecy. Whether in Catholic or secular environments, theological ethics is a practical reflection that challenges all interlocutors to turn their faces to the other in a liberating dialogue committed to the promotion of the human being and to the search for the truth. This double commitment must be critical, grounded on values of justice, respect, tolerance, and love, and go beyond ideological differences. A common commitment to the promotion of the human being and with the search for concrete truth must guide our debates in practical in public arena. Humbly and open to listen to the other, Catholic theological ethics engage in public arena with a discourse able to create a process of mutual learning. When I was invited to participate in this panel, the invitation letter said that several speakers would be invited, quote, to reflect on their practical experience of engaging public square in light of moral issues. Then added that the committee believed I could offer a constructive and thoughtful reflection given my experience in Brazil and USA alike. Considering that and the premise I state above, I will present 4 experiences when I engage in public square in the context of global health as attempts to build bridges between the academic theology and the reality of the destitute sick. The goal of this conference is to build bridges in our world, bridges that can connect us and connect Catholic theological ethics to issues challenging our world today. Our colleague here, M.T. Davila, suggests, quote, public theology as a bridge building, end quote, and that in her case, in my case as well, this, quote, involve bringing 2 often distant worlds, those of the academia and those of the poor. Therefore, I chose 4 examples from 4 different countries, serving different roles in Catholic and secular communities and organizations in public and private sectors. These experiences are attempts to build bridges between the 2 often distant worlds referred by M.T. Davila. There were attempts to bring the academic knowledge to the world of the poor and the voices and faces of the poor to the academia. They are my experience, first, in the ministry of the healthcare ministry in Brazil, second, in a secular NGO in Haiti, third, in a Catholic community in Bolivia, and finally, in a Catholic university in the USA. First, in the Ministry of Health in Brazilian government. My work in Catholic ministry in healthcare, known in Brazil as Pastoral da Saúde, led me to serve in a health council. That is the instrument of social participation of the Brazilian population in decisions and control of the Brazilian public healthcare system. The unified system of health, SUS, healthcare councils at local, state, and national levels. The councils are secular and political environments that help to make decisions for public health care strategies, such as allocation of resources, social control of the actions of the executive branch in the application of the decisions. The councils are also a legal instrument for health advocacy, grounded in the Brazilian Constitution that states health care as a human right. As a political institutions, the members of the council are vulnerable to all kinds of political interests from different ideologies and powers, such as interests of the private health sector and political parties. Corruption is a constant threat. Hot, controversial debate around topics such as abortion, transgender, reassignment, surgery, and health priorities are all present in the agenda of these councils. With this tense, secular, controversial political environment, my experience acting in a council of health was marked by dialogue and commitment to the common good. Ethical values grounded on theological roots were presented as a contribution to the search for better policies toward population health. This was possible because we usually begin our discussions from their reality, from concrete problems, and considering the face of those who were more affected by them. In this sense, my work with the CTEWC in the largest public hospital of São Paulo provide the faces and the voices of the poor whom I brought to the public debate in the Council of Health. Firstly, in local level, then a national one. Even debates around abortion policies or HIV prevention strategies showing the voices of the poor gave me credibility to be listened to and shift the debate from palliative policies addressing the consequence of the problem to the search for sustainable policies that could touch the cause of all social issues. In addition, I have to say that corruption, such as bribery to change my vote, was a constant threat that was faced with spiritual grounds and the support of the Catholic community of Pastoral da Saúde. This support was essential to straighten me to be faithful to our ethical values and commitment to the common good. Second, in a secular NGO in Haiti, I had the opportunity to serve in a secular NGO in the rural area of Mibale, in the central plateau of Haiti. This organization has a commitment to bring healthcare to the destitute sick. Most people working there were not practicing Catholics, but shared the commitment to deliver healthcare to the poor. I had two roles in this organization. First, help them to develop their community-based service with training to the community health workers, and second, provide bioethic education for the local health professionals acting in the NGO's hospital. Jung and Habermas affirm that material spaces affect profoundly the public debate. When a theologian engages in the public discourse, he or she must be aware who his or her public is and where the public square is. This helps to choose the language and the way to approach to the interlocutors and concerned with the common good. Our colleague M.T. Davila also suggests that public theology as an encounter in which the theologians speak to the location and to people whom the Christian message first makes sense. In my experience of this NGO, the first step was to create a culture of encounter, which all of us could be open to learn from one another, having always the same horizon, those whom we were there to serve, the destitute sick. The culture of the encounter didn't eliminate conflicts, but they were healthy ones because this culture created an atmosphere of respect. As a Catholic theologian and a healthcare professional, I could speak openly in my message, but I had to learn, to be humble, to hear their perspectives. Third, in a Catholic community in Bolivia. In this community, the challenge was bigger because the leadership of the Catholic organization was not open to listen to perspectives that were not aligned with the traditional view of the Catholic moral theology, especially regarding family planning and HIV prevention. Naturally, one would think that a Catholic organization would be an easy space for a Catholic atheist to engage in ethical debates that would ground on discourse in public arena. Unfortunately, this does not always happen. My experience in this Catholic community shows that sometimes inside Catholic groups, the debate is hard or does not exist. The relationship is in a vertical line. Therefore, the voices of the poor or those who are interested in understanding their reality and suffering do not count, because the leadership knows all questions and answers. Vertical relationship with authoritative teaching is an approach that hurts the credibility of the church in the public square. This is a paternalist and infantilize the other, ignore the contribution of those who are the faces and voices of the local public arena. This approach is not different from the actions of the colonizers who invaded Latin America and brought the Catholic faith with the force of their sword. I shared this experience because it shows what I don't believe as a way to engage in a public discussion committed to the common good. Vertical approaches do not liberate nor empower people, rather create dependency. I believe in an approach that builds from below, and together we contribute to the common good. And finally, the last one, in a Catholic university in the United States. I teach theological ethics to undergrads in the Catholic University in the US. Taking theology classes is mandatory in these institutions. Most students take these classes because they have to, not because they want to. I teach a course entitled Theology and Global Health. It attracts most students from health majors. My way to approach global health issues from a theological perspective is from below. Thus, I bring the voice of the poor to our discussion. From below is also the pedagogy used in my classes inspired by the liberating method of Paulo Freire. What the students think, want, and have with them as their cultural and educational background matter. I often emphasize, I am also here to learn from you. You can at least teach me how to pronounce better English, but I know you can teach much more than that. When we discuss about issues of public interest, healthcare, from a particular perspective, Catholic theological ethics, and with a common interest, understanding healthcare issues in the theological concept that can help us to address the global health challenges. At the same time, I want to understand how students think they can address health issues and how the degree they are pursuing can help us in this global endeavor. So far, the result has been so interesting. Ethical discourse in public arena require that the other matters, that we all matter and have something to teach and to learn in the common task of searching for comprehensive and integral solutions to the problems that impact the common good. Conclusion. Our colleague here too, Brian Massengel, said that doing public theology means, quote, addressing issues of public concerns, urgency, and important to a religious, pluralistic, and diverse audience, follow members of a civic community in a way that is accessible to people of any or no faith, tradition, or commitment, while rooted in and inspired by one's own faith, perspective, commitment, and beliefs, end quote. These four experiences are only particular example originate from my praxis to attempt to embody the meaning of public theology suggested by Massengel. These experiences are limited to concrete contexts and interlocutors. Therefore, they are not guide for engaging in public discourse, but they reflect my belief that theological ethics and public discourse as a bridge between the academic world and the world of the poor must begin from below, with an ethical encounter that recognizes the other. Simone Weil suggests social relationship as an ethical encounter that recognizes that the other demands a self-disposition. This takes us from our own self to bring our attention to the other's permanent vulnerability to force and suffering. In the public arena, create a bridge between the academic work of theological ethics and the reality of the poor is an exercise of attention to the other and his or her beauty and vulnerability. A humble exercise of mutual learning. Muito obrigado. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you to our 4 speakers, both for very engaging presentations and also for being so cooperative with the time slots. They made the role of the chair a very easy one today, so thank you for that. We have some time now for questions and answers. I would ask, please, that you state your name and you state to whom you are directing your question. And if possible, if you could keep your questions brief, it will allow us to get to more people. Thank you.
Yeah. My name is Stan Chu Ilo. I'm Nigerian. I'm at DePaul University. My question goes to you, Teresa. And it's a fundamental concern to me, and I guess to so many people here. Sometimes when your advocacy comes into direct conflict with the magisterium and the fundamental teaching of the church. And so when that happens, as it often does, who is your constituency here?
Oops. By constituency, you mean the criteria or the group by which you build your criteria?
Yeah.
But constituency, what?
Yeah, what community in terms of, if I would say your locus of enunciation, that is the tradition within which you engage. Because, okay. I mean, if you go back to biblical principles in terms of prophetic tradition, okay. It has to be embedded within a distinctive community with a vision to realizing what that particular distinctive community looks towards in terms of moving from today to tomorrow, so that when you are no longer there, there's something that remains, that continues.
Okay, if I have understood properly, I would answer there are like 2 levels for me of constituency understood as with whom I do that. Have I understood correctly that with whom? My first level is, of course, my community. I did explain briefly about this abortion that I was called to retract, and I did not. But of course, I couldn't do that on my own, in the sense that I did write this letter that was no recantation, but an acclaratio. And I had to submit it, not only to my abbess, but she told me, we have to discuss it in our community. At that moment, I was in Berlin. They discussed it, and the abbess called me again and said, Teresa, your letter that you are sending to Rome and also making public, we have discussed it as a community, and half of the community, approximately, we were then 40 nuns. Half of the community, they don't agree with your argument. They are not convinced by your argument. The other half, they don't understand your argument. So they say, because I did talk about the kidney and I made an example, they say they don't. And the abbess told me, and I don't know if I am of the first half or the second half. He's a very smart abbess, huh? But, and here comes the point, she said, all of us, me included, agree that we want a church and a society where everyone can say what he or she thinks freely. We don't want a society and a church especially full of fear. And that means that they give me the space to make mistakes also. That it's also how I view the issue. I don't view that I have to be convinced that I have the truth to be able to speak in the public space. Of course, I try to do that responsibly, and as a theologian, I always distinguish if something is something that the magisterium supports or something that it does not. But this fear that I spoke briefly about, I think it's hurting us a lot. This fear, it's why should we fear? If I say something ridiculous, then the church has enough institutional power, authority, and everything to say, okay, this little theologian from Barcelona, let her speak, right? Because that's not, why this defensiveness? Why this stress? In trying to be responsible, yes, but in having fear to speak your own word. So I loved the answer of my community. I think it's much better for me to have a community that does not, in a homogeneous way, uphold my views and my ideas, much better than if to have the community I have, which is a community that it doesn't matter what you think, if I am in agreement with you or not, but I'm with you in supporting your free speech and your free voice. And that would be my first level. And of course, the second level is, I believe the people from the parishes that I have met and I'm invited to speak to, and beyond because of the political involvement, people that in the context of the crisis, so the constituency here depends on what is the topic that I'm addressing, right? When I'm speaking about theological or church issues, I think I have in the heart the people of the parish that have all these questions, people that come through the monastery and say, you know what, I don't go to the church anymore because the priest preaches like that and I don't want to hear that, the women that feel excluded in the church and so many others that each of them are particular. And they are not a community in the sense of organized community, but nevertheless, I think are the ones I have in the heart when I talk about this. For the politics is, of course, all the situations of poverty that I'm invited to also share. And for the medicine, it's my colleagues that tell me what's happening with the progressive and very strong, how do you say, commercialization or the presence of the business model in the medicine, how it's taking over. So that.
My question is addressed to Sister Teresa.
Where are you?
Yeah, I am Charles from India. Just a simple, direct question. Before that, I do appreciate your engagement with social activism. While presenting about what you do, you said that there are challenges. Direct question, how do you face the challenges? Do you get some support from somebody, from your community, or your own like-minded group of nuns or people? Just I want to know, where do you get the strength to go ahead with your social engagement?
I have mentioned in my presentation the 90 years old in my community, and maybe I have sounded as if I mentioned them as especially not intelligent or not well read, right? That if they understand it, everybody can understand. But it was particularly in another note that I do that, and I do it really, it's not like a figure of speech, because they are especially bold. My model of boldness is the 90, 95, 100, 101 sisters of my community. I have, as a physician in the community, have the privilege to accompany up to death 2 sisters now with 100, 3 sisters with 100, and now we have one with 101. Well, I don't know what your experience is, and of course, if there is Alzheimer's, what I'm going to say, it's not going to happen with dementia, but when people get to that age, and you don't need to be 100, in my experience, it's 90 is enough. You get to that age, and you develop a freedom of spirit that I am amazed of. I could just listen to them for hours, and they listen to me, but very happily. There is one nun, this one, 101. I published a book recently in Italy called Siamo tutti diversi verso una teologia queer. This sister was the prior abbess, now is 101. She reads Italian. She said, Teresa, give me that book. I said, okay, you have the book. And then she read the book. And of course, next time I see her, she says, what does it mean, queer? Queer is queer, but read like that. That she immediately, and then I explained to her. And then she said, Teresa, you have a mission in the world. And I said, okay, that is really something that I cannot explain better than how I have done. But the fact that in this case, Maria Cecilia, and my prior teacher of novices, that now it's 92, and it's a very conventional, traditional nun. But still, whenever I talk, she gets something out of it, and she just goes and encourages me. So that's my main source. Of course, I can say, and I will say, that how I perceive my prayer, right? How I pray and how I try to understand. For example, I am now 52 years old. 2 years ago, or 1 year ago, I went to the United States, but I did in this time of exclustration. I took 1 month off to do the Ignatian exercises, and I did them in Vermont in the US. I had done them before I entered the monastery. I have been now at the monastery for 21 years. Before I entered, when I was 25, I did the 1 month of Ignatian exercises, and now I did them again 1 year ago. What struck me the most when I did the 3rd week of the Passion, I had never realized before, it's not the pain and the suffering of Jesus what takes the protagonism in those pages of the Passion, it's the mockery. It's how it's presented as somebody to mock, to ridicule. And it's not that what we fear the most, even more than the physical pain or the death. It's like to be ridiculed, to just be looked down upon. To see that, and then to just try to imitate like little bit of that, to try to get close to that, or to try to embody that as much as I can. This gives me, I think, the strength.
There's one in the back. Yeah.
I like to address a question to our journalist, so I'll state clearly that it's off the record. It seems to me that we live in a context where what drives the conversation is the most polarizing and sensational claim. So how do you negotiate that with the need to be truthful? And I ask this not only from your perspective, but from the perspective of somebody that wants to contribute to the conversation, but does not want to say fake things just to raise up our voice.
Well, I think in the ideal scenario, you'd have a relationship with a journalist, and you'd have a sense of what kind of story they're trying to build. And so if it was something, you'd want to guide them to a place where you're comfortable with the storyline or what they're pursuing. But I think if you're talking to a journalist and it's clear to you that they're pursuing something you're not interested in being a part of, just back out. You can say, no thanks, I don't want to give this interview, or I would rather not have this discussion with you now.
Hi. My question is for Father Eric. I found your comments really exhibiting the virtue of prudence in the public square with respect to your pastoral role, the role of the church in the Philippines now under the Duterte leadership and the violence that exists there. And so I so appreciate that, and I'm wondering if you could expand. Where would you see prudential judgment leading to a public voice? You know, you talk about how you withheld voice because you're honoring the spaces where you can help people be safe and help people find safe houses, use the churches, keep their families safe, or bring their grievances when someone has been killed in their family and bury them and bring them some justice. And some pastoral attention. So where would prudential judgment, in your view, lead to a public voice?
I think, at least from my experience as a Jesuit, we've been dealing also in my community with how to talk about the killings. Sometimes we have to choose who would speak for it. We've had experiences of Jesuit brothers who have spoken sort of on their own and made the conversation political when we're actually talking about human rights and protecting people. It's not that we want to get rid of the president, but it's being sometimes interpreted that way. So sometimes we have to choose a spokesperson who can keep the story online. And that's one prudential judgment we've had, that it's not that we're silencing people, but let's stay on track and keep the conversation from being partisan. We're talking about a program that kills people. We're not trying to start a revolution to overthrow the president or anything. Also, we try to choose our battles. There are certain relationships that perhaps be better preserved or nurtured by not entering into a conflictual conversation about whether supporting or not supporting the president. There are certain battles we would choose to do so, and we let those who are the best in articulating our position speak for us. Certainly, we assist in the background. Like there's one bishop in the Philippines, Bishop Pablo David, who is very articulate in speaking about the extrajudicial killing, and he's the bishop I mentioned in my paper about the one who sees as a shepherd both the victims and victimizers part of his flock. He didn't want to divide them like these are sheep and wolves, and I have to get rid of the wolves. I'm trying to save everybody because they all live in the same community. The whistleblowers, those who report the drug addicts, those who the families of the drug users, they all belong to the same community, and he doesn't want to break them up. And so we try to support him by being a presence in his community, but letting him take the lead in speaking out. He has a more pastoral voice and credibility in that sense. So choosing our battles and staying on message, and therefore sometimes taking the sacrifice of not being the one to speak out, but choosing somebody else to be the voice of, say, the community or the province or the parish or the diocese. Those are some prudential choices we have to make, that we know what would trigger the president to attack the church again and what would not. And we try to find a more constructive and more effective way of dealing with it without causing more harm.
Okay, I appreciate that there are more people who would like to ask some questions, but we are actually out of time, and Jim has some announcements that he needs to make. So I'd just like to conclude by thanking our four speakers for their excellent presentations, and then I'll hand you over to Jim.
There's actually quite a number of announcements. I think it's important for us to know about our host here. But yesterday evening, Sister Antonia, those of you who were involved in the memorial may have seen that she was the one who was helping us do the candles and everything else. But right around that time, she learned that her niece, her 12-year-old niece, succumbed to cancer. And this morning's Mass we had as a memorial for her. But Sister Antonia, who's been working with us for days, has had to leave to be with her family. So I just want to try to keep you updated with things that are happening of a magnitude like that. The second is that during this morning, you may have noticed that there were like a number of people, like Spadaro's coming over to me, Darko Tomasevic is coming over, another person's coming over, Antonio's talking to me. I'm looking at my cell phone. Of course, the speaker is watching me looking at my cell phone, saying like, thanks a lot, Jim. And, but what it was there was a police incident at Munich airport. And so one of the more significant donors that I've been working with for years on this project, and we've been talking about this for years, was saying that his plane had just been diverted and he was not going to be able to be with us. I can't say, obviously, who the anonymous donor is, but he wanted to be here. And then we said, oh, well, what does that mean about Cardinal Cupich? And then Cupich is sending me, I need to talk to you immediately. So then we're trying to get phone lines, and now we had Josh involved in it and Darko involved in it, everybody trying to do it. Two people came up, Dave DeCaz came up and said, hey Jim, how are you? And I said, I gotta go. So I just want to explain that sometimes like that, we would like to be more hospitable, but there's other things happening. And so Cardinal Cupich, he's been deeply involved in this conference. When we went to him to talk about this conference, We did because in the United States, the USCCB, the American Bishops' Conference, created, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, a special committee of support for Central and Eastern Europe. And Cardinal Supic, whose origins are Croatian, really said he wanted to help us. So he went to the Bishops' Conference to ask for a sum of money, and then the bishops decided to give him even more, which we were happy with. And so he's actually personal friends with Vinko Puljic. And Cardinal Puljic said he'd be happy to celebrate the liturgy so long as Cardinal Supic was the celebrant. And so then Supic said his plane was canceled, and he was, guess where? Munich. That's when I got his homily, so that we could at least give his homily. And then he said to me, when I finally got him, could you give my homily? And he said, and who should be the celebrant? And I said, Cardinal Turkson. We're going to go find Cardinal Turkson and say, can you celebrate? And we went to Cardinal Turkson, and he said, yes, I can celebrate. Then I got the idea that why don't we ask Andres Vodka, the rector of the Alfonsianum, to read the homily so you don't have to hear this bloody voice again. But by that point, Cardinal Supic was on his way to Vienna to come here, so there was no way for me to ask for permission to change who the reader is. This is just trying to give you an idea of how many different things. I could go on for another 2 hours, but this is just trying to be a little more transparent of what is going on in the background as we're trying to keep this a smooth conference. And so if there's a time, at one point, Craig Ford wanted to say something, and I said, I can't talk, and we're running around. He tried to talk to Kristen Heyer. I said, she can't talk either, because we were trying to get her to talk to the Cardinal. It's the same also with the mics. I could see people wanting me to get to the mic to them. I saw Kevin Ahern wanting to get to the mic, but I couldn't get to him because there were 5 other people who were nearer to me that I needed to get it to. So it's just trying to explain what we're trying to do and why there's some challenges in all this. Cardinal Supic then wanted to know, should I bother to come? That's when I had to find Kristen Heyer again, and we said, yes, please come. He said, well, I won't get in until 9:30, and we said, we'll greet you. But he'll be here tomorrow. He'll be in tonight at 9:30, but we wanted him to come here so that you would meet him just as you'll meet Cardinal Turkson this evening and tomorrow at the dinner. So when you see Cardinal Supic tomorrow, just go out of your way to say, we're really happy you're here. Thanks for your financial support. Thanks for getting Cardinal Puljic to say the Mass with Cardinal Turkson and whatever, but this is how you and your own activism can help make us a network that's closer to one another. By the way, we step forward to help and to do things like that. On that stepping forward, many of you are organizing impromptu meetings around topics or initiatives during this meeting. We applaud this. And we ask everyone to check the bulletin board in the lobby near the registration desk early and often to learn details. There are quite a number of signs going up there about people who want to have conversations. Please have them, and please use the bulletin board as a mode of trying to communicate with one another. We can't encourage that enough. Also, on this same point, somebody stopped me, Megan stopped me about cabs for Sunday night, well, really Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. Most of you who came from the airport were actually taken care of by a cab company run by a man named Valid. I love it. My friend, what's his name? Valid. No, what's his name? Valid. Anyway, Valid is the owner of this company. We're going to put his phone number of his company. He has vans. Some of you came in a van of 6 or 7. That's Valid's vans. Some of you came in cabs of 2 or 3 people. That's Valid's. He can take multiple phone calls. So you can figure out where you want to meet a cab, and we're going to put that up on the board. Maybe not tonight, but it will be there tomorrow morning, and Antonio is going to do that. The last thing, we have the liturgy now at 6 o'clock. Those who are priests who want to celebrate, we ask that if you bring your albs, that'd be terrific. You can vest in the sacristy. There are 50 seats in the sanctuary, so as soon as you vest, just sit in the sanctuary and pray. And then if there are more, you can take the first few rows, but I would ask that you would at least let the planning committee sit in the very first row. Where we're asking them to sit. So is that all clear? All right, so, yes. Oh yeah, if you don't have your alb, there are 50 albs in the sacristy. So just vest with your alb or take it from the sacristy and then go sit and pray, like the rest of us. Thank you.